Vi siete mai chiesti perché sentiamo di esistere? O più precisamente che cos'è la coscienza? O magari vi siete chiesti se lei è cosciente? O che cosa prova lui ad esistere? Io me lo sono chiesto tantissime volte ed è per questo che sono incappata con grande piacere in questo libro, La fonte nascosta, edito da Adelphi e scritto dal neuroscienziato Mark Solms. Tra queste pagine Solms va alla ricerca della coscienza utilizzando la statistica, la fisica, le neuroscienze naturalmente, ma anche la psicanalisi. E la cosa veramente straordinaria è che in questo suo viaggio pone al centro di tutto quanto gli affetti, ossia le sensazioni, le emozioni, i sentimenti, che secondo Solms sono ciò che ci guida nel mondo e sono anche i primi correlati della coscienza, che da funzione gerarchicamente superiore e quindi propria soltanto degli esseri umani e forse di qualche primate, diventa invece una funzione organizzata gerarchicamente nel cervello, che sì, certo, si esprime anche nelle aree più sofisticate cerebrali, ma che origina in realtà dal cervello profondo, quindi da quello più antico che condividiamo con tantissimi altri animali. Con l'aiuto di Adelphi, che lui si ringrazia, ho incontrato Mark Solms in un bel giorno di luglio e gli ho posto alcune domande, nella speranza che le sue risposte possano far luce su quegli stessi interrogativi che tutti ci siamo posti almeno una volta nella vita.
Ciao Mark, welcome to Lucy, that today is outdoor. We are here because you wrote this beautiful book. It's called in Italian La fonte nascosta, and it's your journey to find consciousness into our brain. As a reader, I think one of the most beautiful things of this book was the fact that you try to bring the reader in also with your experience of the world and your passion for neuroscience that comes from also your biography, your life. How do you think you started to being interested in this field?
I think that we underestimate children. Children think about big questions like what's going to happen to them when they die, what is the relationship between their minds and their bodies. Children think about these things. But I had a traumatic experience when I was little, which made me, I think, forced me to think about it perhaps a little bit earlier and perhaps a little more deeply than most children. And that is that my brother, my older brother, who was really very close to me. We lived in a small village. He was my best friend, my biggest playmate. When he was 6 years old, he fell from a very from the third floor, from the roof of a building, but it was 3 stories high, and he fell onto his head, onto the pavement below, and he suffered a hemorrhage in his brain, and he fractured his skull. When he returned from the hospital, he looked the same, but he was not the same person at all. He was very different. And in fact, his whole life has been very different from mine. But even as a child, or especially as a child, it was deeply disturbing to get your head around, how come he looks like and is Lee? His name was Lee, but he isn't Lee. He's a different person now. And clearly, I understood this had to do with the fact that his brain had been damaged. So this sort of forced me to confront the simple fact that somehow we are our brains. That there's this bodily organ inside of the vault of your skull, which is just an organ, but somehow it is also literally who you are. I remember as a child thinking, if that can happen to him, it means it can happen to me. I too am my brain, and that's got me onto this path.
At some point in the book, you say that consciousness is what is able to, let us manage in our life and to choose in a context what to do emotionally. And for me, this was my instinct also. So how do you define them?
Okay, now words like instinct, unfortunately, and it's not the only one, not everybody means the same thing when they use those words. So let me at least be clear about what I mean when I say instinct. I distinguish the following things. First of all, there's a need. Okay? A need is, let me use the example of we have nutritional needs. You know, your body needs nutrients, including energy supplies, including sugar. The sugar is stored in the fatty tissues of your body, and you're constantly burning up those sugars. That is because you have a need for glucose, but you're not conscious of anything there. Then, once those energy supplies are dwindling, you feel hungry. That's a drive. So that's the need turned into a drive. Then how do you respond to that felt need, respond to that drive? That's what an instinct is for. So to the extent, this is the crux of the matter, to the extent that your instinctual behaviors satisfy your drive, to that extent the feeling gets better. So it's a bad feeling when you have a drive that's not satisfied. It's a good feeling when it is satisfied. And because the instinctual behavior doesn't always satisfy it, then you do something else randomly initially. You do something else, and then you learn from the experience, from the feeling. So now you don't only have instincts, you have voluntary actions and learning from the experience of performing voluntary actions. That's how feeling underwrites choice. Choice has to be rooted in a value system. In other words, there has to be a good choice and a bad choice. There has to be something which is a good outcome or a bad outcome. And feelings are that value system. So a good choice is one that makes you feel better. A bad choice is one that makes you feel worse. And so your choices are guided by actions. You change what you're doing on the basis of whether or not it is meeting the underlying need, which is felt as a drive. So learning supplements instinct, and the way in which we supplement instinct is learning what works and what doesn't work, and that is through feeling that we register what's working and what's not working.
And you said that in a way, like what happened and what you felt at some point during your childhood led you to study and also had life that you had. But you were not conscious about this when you were younger. When I was reading you, that's something that struck me, because I thought, if feelings are so important for consciousness, for being conscious of something, how can our feelings bring us towards something while we're not conscious of it?
You say, how come we're guided by feelings and yet we're so unconscious of what it is that we're doing? That is the way in which people use the word unconscious. Really, what we're unconscious of is the thought processes, the decisions, the memory of where this choice comes from. But the feelings are always conscious. So to put it simply, you have a feeling, I don't like this guy. It's conscious. You don't know why you don't like this guy. It's unconsciously he reminds you of some other person that you had a horrible experience with, or unconsciously it's because he's got the same name as your worst enemy from childhood or something like that. So that we're unconscious of. That's what we mean mostly when we say the person is unconscious of their motives. But the motive is driven by a feeling that they are conscious of. They just don't know where the feeling comes from. And there's experimental evidence of this sort of thing. You can do experiments where you show photographs, for example, very briefly, just a few milliseconds. You show photograph of a face. The person doesn't know they've seen anything because it's so brief, really just a few milliseconds. And under that face it says rapist, face A. Then there's face B, and under that face it says philanthropist. The person doesn't know that they've seen anything, but after that experiment you then show them the photographs consciously, and you say, which of these two people do you like? And they say, I don't know them. Then you say, yeah, but just what's your gut feeling? Which one do you like? And they all say face B. So we know why they like face B. It's because face B is a philanthropist and face A is a rapist. They don't know that. But what they do know is they have a gut feeling. I don't like that guy. I prefer this one. So that's a central part of my book, actually, that this question of feelings and their intimate relationship with consciousness. You can't have a feeling without feeling it.
For a lot of time we thought that the location of consciousness was the cortex, the prefrontal cortex, which is also something that not so many animals have, actually. Why do you think we were, and we still are actually, so sure that consciousness is such an high function?
We think consciousness is what I experience. But as you just said, there are other primates which have frontal cortex, but less than us. So they presumably are conscious, but not in the same way as us. They don't have language. Surely this changes their consciousness. Then there are creatures that have no cortex. Does that mean that they have no consciousness? So the starting point was the idea that consciousness means what I experience. But anybody who's got a cat or a pet dog, they can see that they're conscious too. Our consciousness, if you just look at what you're experiencing right now, the main thing that you are experiencing is vision. Visual experience is the dominating quality of experience. Then, because we're having a conversation, the next thing is hearing. The consciousness of not only hearing, but hearing these very complex sounds that is language that we can hold in mind and we can interpret the meaning of. Then there's the feeling of me being in this chair. That's called somatic sensation, which most people call a touch. And then there's taste, and then there's smell. That is what our consciousness consists of. That's because in us, with cortex, those properties dominate our consciousness. But what about birds? The way that they behave, you think surely these creatures are feeling something. They're making choices, by the way, in what they do. So but then you're clearly not talking about the same sort of consciousness as you and I are experiencing. So here's the crucial issue, is that you can remove the entire cortex. Unfortunately, this is done. There are many experiments where the cortex is removed in its entirety, and obviously in animals, in animal experiments. In dogs, in cats, in mice, in rats, in guinea pigs, it's done a lot. When you remove the cortex of these animals, they continue to behave in all sorts of clearly emotional ways. They act on their needs. We were talking earlier about drives and the feelings that come with them. These animals, they play, they fight, they show fear, they copulate, they raise their puppies, to maturity with no cortex at all. And human beings who are born with no cortex, there are human beings who, due to disease, are born with no cortex. They're the same, like those animals with no cortex. They are awake, they're conscious, they show all the basic emotions. They show fear, they show rage, they show laughter and happiness, and in a way that's appropriate. If you give a child with no cortex, you give them a fright, they startle, you tickle them, they laugh, and so on. If you remove that type of consciousness, the type of consciousness that cortex provides, this high human type of consciousness and this external perceptual type of consciousness, you remove that, you still have a conscious animal or a conscious child, but now the kind of consciousness that you have is mostly emotional consciousness. It's feeling, they're guided just by feelings. But if you damage just a small area in a human being, in the deep brain stem, there's an area called the parabrachial complex. And if you damage just 2 cubic millimeters of that, you're in a coma. So to sum up, the deep part of the brain actually is where the consciousness comes from. It activates the cortex, and then that's how we become aware of all these things that the cortex is processing. So the cortex is processing all this external stuff, but it's only made conscious by virtue of the fact that it's activated from within the brainstem.
In the world, in the physics that we live in, a lot of different self-organizing systems are actually structured like us, like our brain. How can we know, and why do some systems have a consciousness and some don't?
So the point that you started with is terribly important for people to understand, that there is a thing called a self-organizing system, which just occurs in nature. What people need to understand is that they just naturally occur, systems which try to maintain their structural integrity. They try to continue to exist as a thing. And eventually what you have is a subset of self-organizing systems which are living systems. Living systems emerge from self-organization. And what the defining feature of a self-organizing system is everything that it does is designed to maintain its existence. When I say they're trying to continue existing, what they have to have some prediction. They have to have some plan in them that if I do this, then that will happen. If there's no plan, then they'll do random things and random things will happen and they will dissipate. So there has to be some principle that organizes what they do. That's what we mean by the principle of self-organization, that what the system does it has a purpose. The purpose is to continue to exist. So the additional adaptation beyond that is the capacity to match. If what's happening is not what I expected would happen, then can I change what I'm doing in order to make the expected outcome or the needed outcome occur? So that is learning. That is the capacity to update your predictions. So that's only complex animals can do that. So now you say, how do we know at which point they become conscious? And it's that functionality that I've just spoken about now. So any creature that is able to survive in an unpredicted environment, in other words, where unexpected things are happening, it's able to adjust its behavior in order to accommodate to, not by a reflex, not by an instinct, but by a voluntary action, which must be guided by, is this working or isn't this working? That's what feeling is for. So any creature that can do that, it's got the functionality of feeling.
I have one last question. At some point, of course, there is the question of, can we make a system like an AI conscious?
Up until a few years ago, I would have thought, there's no way that there's any possibility of an artificial consciousness. But I've changed my mind about that. And the reason I've changed my mind about that is precisely because I've come to recognize, on the basis of all of my neuroscientific work, that the most basic form of consciousness is simply raw feeling. And feeling is nothing other than a self-organizing system being able to monitor how well or badly it's doing in terms of meeting its needs. In other words, I am or am not going to continue existing depending on how well or badly this is going. And if it has multiple, and it only matters to the system. It doesn't matter to me whether that system carries on existing, but it matters to the system. And I think that on the basis of these principles, I think it's not a question of can we engineer an artificial consciousness in the sense of an artificial form of feeling. It's not a can, it's when will we. I think it's that.
It's when.
But I want to say one last thing, which is that the crucial question comes down to this. Are we willing to say, what is it like from the system's point of view? Remember, that is taking the subjective perspective. It's a legitimate question to ask, what is it like to be that machine? And that is the big leap that we have to make. We have to be willing to ask the question.
Thank you very much, Mark. It was a beautiful conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Lucy.